The idea of reissuing landmark titles has been with us since the early days of video games, but there's little doubt that the number of re-releases has steadily increased over the last decade. They come in many forms: remakes, remasters, emulation, and more, but the goal is the same: enable a new audience to experience a beloved game on modern platforms. As technology marches forward, however, the discussion around this topic has expanded to include an element of uncertainty. At which point is it too early to remake a game, many have asked? Has the law of diminishing returns rendered this approach less viable? When Naughty Dog revealed The Last of Us Part 1 earlier this year, a complete visual remake of the original The Last of Us, debates around this topic heated up. Many were surprised to see The Last of Us return only 8 years removed from the remastered version of the original game. Is it too soon? Has enough really changed since the original? We at Digital Foundry have wondered the same thing, and after spending time with the final release, we finally have some answers. Thus, I've prepared an exhaustive comparison with prior versions of The Last of Us that will hopefully allow viewers to see what has or has not changed in the journey to PS5. This also includes comparisons with The Last of Us Part 2 and even pre-release versions of The Last of Us. Along the way, we'll discuss the new rendering improvements, discuss the video modes available, and determine just how the gameplay has changed. So let's get into it. The Last of Us was essentially PlayStation 3's swan song, a showpiece title created and released by Naughty Dog just months before the arrival of the then next-generation PlayStation 4. The mix of storytelling, survival horror, and action resonated with fans, becoming one of their most successful games ever. The challenge Naughty Dog created for itself, though, was the creation of a world almost entirely devoid of electric lights. The Last of Us relies heavily on indirect lighting, which, in 2013, was still very difficult to achieve, even when leaning on pre-calculated techniques. The development team did manage to come up with a suitable solution to this problem for the era. It's far from perfect, mind you, but the world was convincingly lit and designed. It captivated players. Problem is, on the PlayStation 3, the performance just didn't hold up, and many of the larger areas exhibited severe frame rate issues that detracted from the experience. The Last of Us pushed the PS3 so hard that it basically turned the console into a tiny space heater. You remember those fan noises, right? And this is where PlayStation 4 enters the picture. You see, just 1 year later, Naughty Dog released a remastered version of the game for the new console, offering higher resolutions and a smoother frame rate, effectively overcoming these issues inherent in the original release. Remastered also allowed Naughty Dog the opportunity to get to grips with the PS4 hardware, so to speak, before shifting development to their next original title. Then again, just a couple years later, the team returned to The Last of Us once again with an update for the newly released PlayStation 4 Pro, allowing native 4K rendering at 30 frames per second. For all intents and purposes, the game was in great shape, so when it was announced that it would be remade for PlayStation 5, it was met with some confusion and apathy. It looks and runs well on PS5 already, so what more could they really offer? Turns out, there's a lot more to the project than we had anticipated. Naughty Dog has basically remade every inch of the game's assets, and as you'll soon discover, there is a lot to compare. But before we dive into those comparisons, let's talk about the basics. What do you get in this package and what modes are on offer? So firstly, The Last of Us Part 1 includes the original campaign and the Left Behind DLC. The main menu has been fleshed out with additional options and modes, including a robust extras menu, but the Factions multiplayer mode has not made the jump. This is a single player only release. If you're a multiplayer fan, keep this in mind. In the options menu, however, players are once again handed a selection of visual modes based on your preference. Part 1 includes both a fidelity and performance mode, kinda like Remastered did on the PS4 Pro, but it also offers the option to unlock the frame rate. Oliver will be covering the actual numbers in a performance-focused video, but it shakes out like this in terms of image quality. Fidelity mode delivers native 4K at 30 frames per second by default, while performance mode offers 60 frames per second at what appears to be an entirely 1440p image. The game specifies dynamic 4K in the menu, but it's confusing. You see, when pixel counting a game, you basically take a collection of samples in different scenarios. In general, you'll find the lower pixel counts in busy, heavy areas of the game, while the higher pixel counts closer to 4K would appear in quiet, empty rooms. In this case, every shot I checked came in at 1440p, so even if it does change, what you're going to see during most of the gameplay is 1440p. The good news is that the performance and fidelity mode look otherwise identical outside of image quality. I say this because if you remember, the PS4 Pro version of Remastered does feature visual changes depending on which mode you select. That's not the case here. Now, if you use a 120Hz screen, it is possible to use this mode at 40 frames per second instead. Furthermore, if your display offers VRR support, you can unlock the frame rate, allowing it to go above 60 FPS in the performance mode or above 40 in fidelity. Now, for the comparisons in this video, unless otherwise noted, I've opted to use the fidelity mode. The reason for this is simple. Both Part 1 and Remastered on PS4 Pro support native 4K output only in quality mode, and I felt it was prudent to perform comparisons at the highest possible pixel count. In cases where the performance mode is used instead, however, look for this label right here. For most of the video, I'm using the PS4 Pro version as a point of comparison so that you can most clearly see the original assets, but for good measure, this is how it compares against the PS3 original. As you can see, the PS3 version runs at just 720p, targets 30 frames per second, though often drops below it, and features lower quality shadows as well as a low level of anisotropic filtering. With this established then, let's get into the comparisons with the PS4 Pro version of the game and discuss some of the changes made in rebuilding it. So as we get into our first comparison, let me explain the rendering profiles, so to speak, on prior versions of the game versus this new one. So on PlayStation 3 and PlayStation 4, The Last of Us marries Naughty Dog's real-time graphics engine used during gameplay with pre-rendered cutscenes. This is really important to note because until Uncharted 4, Naughty Dog's cinematic games all relied on video clips rather than real-time rendered sequences to present its story. Which means anytime we're comparing cutscenes, we're looking at video clips on the PS4 Pro or PS3 side versus real-time cutscenes on PS5. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now. With this in mind, let's begin by discussing the cutscenes. In addition to moving from pre-rendered video to real-time sequences, The Last of Us Part 1 features noticeable improvements in terms of character rendering, effects work, such as depth of field or motion blur, and the conveyance of emotion. Every character has been revamped from top to bottom. It feels as if Naughty Dog wanted to find a balance between creating more realistic digital humans while still respecting the original source material. In doing so, I would describe the new models as more natural in appearance, yet still very much The Last of Us. So knowing this, let's pause right here and examine everyone's favorite prepper, Bill. Bill is a secondary character that appears early in the story, and his revised model demonstrates a great deal of improvement. Skin rendering is now far more natural. The just off-camera glare of the window illuminates his sweat-soaked brow on PS5. Subsurface scattering simulates the penetration and dispersion of light beneath the skin. His facial hair and eyes are more realistic, while his clothing has been significantly upgraded. The same holds true for Tess in an earlier sequence. Hair, skin, and clothing all take on a more convincing appearance, much like Bill. Her fresh look is reflective of her presumably difficult life up to this point. In that same scene, Ellie's character model also demonstrates how the push towards increasingly realistic rendering has had an impact on proportions as well. Ellie on the right simply looks more like a real person that could conceivably exist in the real world, versus the more stylized original design. Many of the key technical improvements made for The Last of Us Part 2, such as eye rendering, are featured in this new version of the game. Yet the real benefit in this change stems more from the performance of these characters than just pure rendering features. And by performance, I don't mean frame rate. So take this scene on PS4 Pro. It's an emotionally charged moment, and one that leans heavily on subtle facial animation to really sell it. It looks great in its original form, but Uncanny Valley strikes, leading to the perception that something is just a little bit off, particularly with the eyes. Now look at this same scene on PlayStation 5 and watch those eyes very closely. The development team has seemingly poured a lot of additional effort into this aspect of the game using modern technology to better sell the intended emotion, and comparing them side by side really demonstrates this. Naughty Dog poured a lot of engineering effort into eye rendering for the last two games, including the simulation of eye caustics and implementing screen space shadows. Even though the cutscenes in the original game are pre-rendered, they were built on their real-time engine technology at the time, so features like this were not utilized. The key here is that all of the story sequences have received a similar upgrade. It now feels much more on par with something like The Last of Us Part 2, which was already a massive upgrade from the original. There's also another benefit to switching to real-time cutscenes. The transition between gameplay and cutscene is now far more seamless. In the original version, there's a stark black screen between gameplay and cutscene. On PS5, it instantly jumps from the gameplay to the cutscene in comparison, which feels more seamless. Furthermore, this also allows for more natural transitions into gameplay, like this scene here. On PS4, as the cutscene comes to an end, it blacks out for a second, then randomly drops you here in front of the door. This same sequence plays a lot differently on PS5, cutting smoothly into the gameplay with Joel leaning up against the door. But there's more. Cutscene direction has also received numerous tweaks. While many follow the same basic structure and flow, new camera angles are often used, and animation tweaks are present. Lens simulation is enhanced, with motion blur shutter speed now correctly tuned for different frame rate options, unlike The Last of Us Remastered by the way, and depth of field that is far more cinematic. Furthermore, the precious few scenes that were actually real-time on PS4 and by extension PS3 have been completely remade. This scene, for instance, highlights an issue with rendering characters within dimly lit environments. It's an issue that many Unreal Engine 3 games also dealt with during this era, but as you can see, the updated scene on PS5 manages to completely sidestep this issue with far more accurate lighting conditions. The way the indirect lighting bounces around the room and across these character models actually looks good now, whereas on PS3 and PS4 I'd argue this scene looks pretty bad by today's standards. Speaking of which, check out this scene here. Halfway through the game, Joel triggers a trap that causes this containment door to slam down, dividing up the crew. You might not think much about it the first time through, but let's talk about the lighting. On PS4 Pro, note how Henry's flashlight bleeds through the wall, illuminating an area that it should not. And check out the lighting on Ellie's face in this scene, it's very harsh and unrealistic. Now if we bring in the PS5 version for comparison, I think you see why I mention it. The difference here is dramatic and demonstrates how much more effective the lighting model is in The Last of Us Part 1. The scene is completely transformed in this new version of the game. Another sequence early in the game serves as another demonstration of this. Check out the difference in this character model. Aside from the fact that the character is now completely different, the change in lighting helps a lot. This is a really good demonstration of things we'll talk about later with regards to the way materials and lighting work within the game world. But boy is the difference gigantic when looking at this guy. Now if we continue through the scene, you might notice that the explosion in the background is a lot more dramatic as a result of projecting light and shadows on PS5, unlike PS3 and PS4 where it does not. The point is, when it comes to cutscenes, there are dramatic changes in this version of the game. But the last comparison we've just completed hints at where the real differences lie: the real-time graphics. So let us take a tour through several sequences and discuss the visual changes on deck. We'll begin right here during the game's introduction sequence. On the night of the outbreak, players are handed control of Joel's daughter Sarah, giving you a chance to explore the world before things go wrong. This is one of the rare scenes in the game featuring electric lights which cast shadows. In the original version, shadows exhibit a harsh, high-contrast edge. It kinda sorta resembles the old stencil shadows we saw in Doom 3. But let's check out this same scene on PlayStation 5. Sarah's shadow now exhibits a gentle fall-off with a soft penumbra, becoming increasingly diffuse at a distance. Check out the shadow cast by the ceiling fan and you should see what I mean. A shadow's sharpness is basically determined by the light source type, distance, and position. The electric lights during this introduction are producing overly strong shadows on PlayStation 4 Pro, while the new version of the game offers much more realistic shadows in comparison, though not necessarily on par with ray-traced shadows. One other cool detail: if you look in the mirror here on PS4 Pro, you'll see that the fan does not cast a shadow within the reflection, but in the new game, this shadow is still visible. Moments later, an infected neighbor bursts through the patio door. Joel fires his first shot. If we pause, check it out. The muzzle flash caused by discharging the firearm produces a shadow on PS5 now, something absent in the original version. Now, before we continue with the game's introduction, let's take a look outdoors. On PS4 Pro, despite the distance between the shadow casting object and the surface here, the shadows appear extremely sharp. From this distance, more realistic shadows would appear more diffuse, which is how they're displayed in the PS5 version. Remember, the distance of the sun versus the tree branch versus the surface on which it is cast determines the sharpness of the shadow. But this only really tackles half the equation. That is, shadows projected directly from a light source, including the sun. But even in the PlayStation 3 original, Naughty Dog developed a clever solution for ambient shadows as well. Look around Joel's feet, and you should see what I mean. This has of course been improved in the PS5 version, and is more consistent with The Last of Us Part 2. So what does that mean? Well, to better understand it, let's look at this scene here. We have this large, bright window against the back wall. But if you look at the shadow coming from Joel, and Ellie for that matter, you'll note that the shadow directionality is incorrect. The shadow moves towards the light source rather than away. As far as I can tell, in most scenes anyways, only the sun is sampled to determine directionality, which is consistent with the sun's placement in this specific level outside the building. Now on PS5, the big difference here is that it now seems to sample from more light sources, so when you stand next to the same window, the shadows now project in the correct direction. So basically, shadow directionality is greatly improved here. Oh, and while we're here, check this out. The filthy, bunched up carpet lying around the room, if you step on top of it, it'll actually move with your footsteps, and the same is true for the enemies as well. Yeah, The Last of Us Part 1 features reactive carpets. I also appreciate how the ambient shadows can interact with subtle reflections, like in this case, you can see some semblance of a reflection deep in the glossy wood. So let's continue making our way through the introduction then. Take note of the volumetric lights streaming through the window. The original The Last of Us uses a technique first devised for Uncharted 3 to create volumetric lights from specific sources. It's not a screen space effect, but given that this was made for PS3, it's pretty impressive. With Part 1 on PS5, however, they seem to have shifted towards a more modern, frustum-aligned voxel solution for volumetric lighting, which is used far more often throughout the game, as we'll see soon enough. Now, as they begin to drive down the road, there are several key things I'd like you to note. Firstly, the properties of glass are now simulated on PS5. Light passes over the windshield and sunroof, revealing the texture and dirt beneath. The glass is not perfectly transparent as it is on PS3 and PS4. Headlights now project shadows on PS5 as well, and the volumetrics are used more heavily throughout the scene. Moments later, while passing a burning house, you might notice that fire emits light on PS5. In this specific scene, however, they attempt to simulate this on PS4 as well, once the fire is off screen anyways. But check out the horizon. This kinda suggests that there's some trickery in play to create the effect just for this scene, which is not unusual, but it's something to keep in mind when we talk about fire going forward. So once we get to the next road then, I noticed that the headlights in the new version of the game now show more visible reflections on street signs, and light pollution is simulated in the distance. You know, the diffuse luminance of the night sky caused by electric lighting flooding into the atmosphere. It'll be the last time we see it in this world, I suppose. Now once they stop in traffic, pay attention to the way the headlights influence the volumetric lighting and the way in which shadows are presented within this volumetric body. Not to mention the subtle glow of the taillights dancing around the character silhouettes. All of these represent a significant difference compared to the original version. Shortly after this then, Tommy drives into a crowd trying to escape, and just as they make it through, another vehicle slams into them from the left. But if we pause it, have you ever stopped and looked closely at the driver? Following the accident, the crew dust themselves off and begin making their way to a safe zone. This next section is interesting though, and there's two things I want to point out. Firstly, as you make your way through the crowd, pay close attention to their movement in this scene. On PS4, panicked pedestrians often photobomb their way into the camera frustum, you could say. If you pause at certain frames, you'll see exactly what I mean. It's funny, but it does detract a little bit from the atmosphere. In the new version, however, crowd behavior seems to have been modified to minimize the chance of a collision with the camera, reducing the chances of something like this happening in the first place. Secondly, as we saw with the farmhouse earlier, fire and explosions now emit light on PS5. How does it manifest? Well, when this gas station goes up in flames, let's pause the action again. The area around the explosion is now volumetrically lit and light pours out across the scene on PlayStation 5. In its original form, however, there is no light generated here as it would likely have been too expensive. That's not to say the scene is devoid of lighting entirely on PS4. There is one large light here on the left that's casting shadows, as you can see. Though like so many other lights in this game, the directionality of the shadows doesn't really seem consistent with the light source's position. But the improved material response and volumetric lighting in the new game definitely makes a big difference. So let's continue down the street then. This explosion here triggers a larger fire, and when running through the alleys, the light from this fire should illuminate the entire scene, but as you can see on PS4, it's completely dark here. In the new version, however, light from this aforementioned fire now spills into the alley, creating this beautiful orange hue. The light dispersion and reflections look so much more realistic here, whereas on PS4 you have, well, this trash can that just sort of sits out almost like it's been photoshopped in. As we round the corner then, the fire brightly illuminates the smoke pouring from the building, while the resulting light casts shadows. Then as you make your way down the hill, note how the ambulance emergency lighting also illuminates the surroundings on PS5. So we're seeing a lot of changes in the way that lighting works, and that becomes a lot more evident once we get away from the electric lighting into the more naturally lit world of the rest of the game. This is when we really start to see how much the environment has been changed. The actual increase in geometric detail is certainly significant. Everything is more fleshed out and richly sculpted. In this scene, for instance, they've added detailed railings, new materials, lighting fixtures, switches, smoothed off the edges on the steps, and increased the amount of incidental detail around the scene. Out on the street, it's much the same. Texture detail is boosted, buildings have been completely revamped, new structures introduced, tons of small flourishes everywhere. But it's the lighting that perhaps stands out the most. Now, I've gone into detail on this in the past, but from what I can tell, Naughty Dog basically rolled their lighting technology developed for The Last of Us Part 2 directly into Part 1. This also means that you get improvements to other things that were introduced in Uncharted 4, such as physically based materials. Remember, The Last of Us was released just before physically based rendering became the norm. Naughty Dog's first game to utilize it was, of course, Uncharted 4. And we've spoken about it often, but the contrast between the original game and this new version really demonstrates what you get. Basically, the idea here is that surfaces, whether brick, stone, wood, leather, or something else entirely, all approximate the behavior of light across their surface, more closely matching how it functions in real life, rather than relying purely on artist intuition. So now surfaces have a base color, of course, plus roughness, specularity, and metallic properties. But how does this manifest in the game? Okay, how about this scene? What do you think? Which looks more natural to your eyes? Consider the way light streams through those windows behind Joel and into the scene. How about this sequence instead? It's raining in both scenes, but the materials and objects on the left behave very differently than what you see on the right, I think. The tech art team has done a phenomenal job at capturing the properties of wet cement. It's also evident during the street scene that occurs during the night. The mix of volumetric fog and the increased specularity on the otherwise rough pavement creates this rather striking, more realistic looking scene. Think of the pavement in this instance as a sort of rough mirror reflecting light as a result of the wetness. The original appears rather matte and unrealistic in comparison, I think. But it's not just the rain. Water in general has been massively overhauled in numerous areas. First thing you'll notice, reflections are now far more prominent. While I certainly would have preferred ray tracing, the team opted instead for a mix of high-resolution cube maps and screen space reflections. Wait, let's rewind that a second. Look closely at the water line resting alongside this vehicle here. You can see both geometric ripples and foam alongside the intersection point. Basically, those points where water sloshes up against dry land are much better defined and more realistic looking in this new version of the game. What also surprised me is the quality and resolution of the game's cube maps. They're seemingly hand-placed to provide the best approximation of detail and parallax while seamlessly blending with SSR. It works really well. Cube map usage is certainly improved over the original game, like in this scene where the reflections are not even remotely consistent with the environment around it. It just looks like a generic glossy reflection. But there's another cool trick I noticed. Note how the flashlight beam interacts with the water surface. They're simulating a form of light scattering, causing the beam itself to take on the color of the water. This might be achieved by placing a fog volume beneath the water layer, which then picks up the light from the flashlight. If we look at the original version, however, there is no attempt to simulate this at all. But there's more to say about the flashlight in a moment. The ripples that appear while swimming or wading through water are also far more prominent in The Last of Us Part 1, something you can see clearly in this scene. Furthermore, tributaries and streams now include flow simulation, modeling how water passes over and around rock formations, complete with foam generation. Another new detail. An additional caustics layer is applied to the environment when your flashlight intersects with the water surface. It's not surface accurate, mind you, as that would require proper ray tracing, but it is a neat trick that adds an extra dimension to the presentation, I think. This area, by the way, exhibits one of the more impressive transformations. In its original incarnation, the fog here produces a muddy image that is somewhat difficult to parse. In its new form, the difference is far more dramatic. The environment itself is overhauled completely and the lighting is much more dramatic. Plus, the water itself looks excellent with those gorgeous ripples. Underwater fogging also receives a massive upgrade, more closely resembling the look of a camera lens plunged into a pool of filthy water. Of course, the massive transformation in this scene is due to the shift in lighting quality. The original The Last of Us was impressive for a 2013 PlayStation 3 game, but the work done for its sequel is deployed in this remake, enabling far more realistic environments and material response. This tunnel here on the campus is a nice example. Sun is pouring in from the left of the scene here on PS4 Pro, but the tunnel itself remains largely bathed in shadow. In this updated version, while the sun position has now been shifted to the right of the scene, note how the light behavior differs. Their solution now simulates the phenomenon of light entering an area and essentially bouncing around the room, illuminating the tunnel in the process. It is pre-calculated, of course, but very effective, and it's something they use throughout the game. In fact, just about any shadowed area tends to exhibit this sort of behavior in the original game, leading to a less realistic appearance, something the remake improves greatly. I especially love this scene here, the light pouring in, the particles in the air, the light bouncing around the room, illuminating areas that should be lit while those in shadow remain suitably dark. It's very effective. And here's another excellent demonstration of this technique in action. On the right, they simulate the sunlight pouring into the dome structure and reflecting back up onto the ceiling, whereas on the PS4 Pro side, it's completely blacked out. There is no indirect lighting at all on that ceiling. This also applies to local occlusion. Look at the chair here on PS4 Pro. It's also bathed in shadow, but it looks like it's basically floating. There's no shadow beneath it at all. The same scene on PS5 does feature a different chair model, but if you pay close attention to its base, there is delicate shading around there. Of course, the rest of the scene features more significant changes with a dramatic boost in detail. On the topic of lighting, I want to talk about the flashlight again. This is an essential item used while exploring the game's many dark spaces. One of the features included in the original is secondary bounce from the flashlight beam. So if you point your flashlight at a red wall, for instance, you'll get a subtle bounce contribution from it. They used what was called a reflective shadow map to pull this off even on PS3, but there's a drawback. It's only used on specific surfaces and in select scenes due to its computational cost. Most of the time, there's no effect, so while it is cool, it's also fundamentally limited. With The Last of Us Part 1 on PS5, however, the secondary bounce is far more frequent, even in moderately lit environments. So if you say, point your light at a reddish-brown panel, the area around you takes on this color with a beautiful subtle glow. They've basically fleshed this feature out on PS5, but be warned, it does come with a slight performance hit in certain areas, specifically when using the 40Hz mode. The other thing I like is the animated gobo texture used within the center of the flashlight beam. Now, this was also in the original game, but it's basically the visualization of the bulb housing casting a shadow within the flashlight itself. You can see it manifest if you look right in the center of the light cone. The size and clarity of the shape varies based on distance from a surface. Again, it's a very realistic feature and it looks great here. But alright, let's talk about the detail as well. Texture detail is boosted across the board compared to the original release. This becomes extra clear in situations like this, where this large painting not only features a lower resolution texture, but also lacks the material properties now evident in the remake. It really shows off the sheen of its glossy surface now. And yeah, if you stop and look closely at just about any of the assets, you'll spot similar differences. From these distant trees, which rely on a flat, non-moving texture here on PS4 Pro, to the massive boost in the amount of foliage in each scene. Heck, if you simply tilt the camera directly down towards the ground while standing still, you'll spot equally massive improvements in detail. Furthermore, Naughty Dog has packed the environments with loads of new incidental details, decorating areas that were previously more sparsely populated in the original. Not only do these objects have physics properties assigned to them, but you can pause and zoom way in with the camera, and most of the objects will hold up even under very close scrutiny. Beyond this, the PS5 version also employs GPU particle simulation for all manner of things, including, most effectively, spore simulation. They've also added a lot of additional mirrors throughout the game, and sometimes they have gameplay implications, like this mirror here in the stairwell. It's not present on PS4 Pro, but if we look at this same sequence here on PS5, check it out. You can actually see an enemy hiding around the corner behind the cabinet, visible in this mirror. Cool, right? I could continue to hammer this home with additional examples, of course, but I think by now you get the picture. Do these shiny new graphics alone warrant this upgrade? That's entirely subjective, but I can say that I enjoyed comparing the two. It is extremely evident that a lot of time and effort really was poured into recreating this world. That said, I did notice one instance where the original game does have a minor advantage. So in Remastered, when Joel walks beneath trickling water like this, the game generates particles to simulate splashes as it runs down his outfit. In Part 1, however, this no longer seems to occur. So it does seem like the original game has that one thing going for it at least. As for how it compares against The Last of Us Part 2, that is perhaps a more difficult question to answer. It's clear that the work done on Part 1 is derived from the upgrades created for the second game, but I would say that they largely feel similar. Cutscenes are of comparable quality and both look exceptionally good. These real-time scenes are among the best looking cutscenes I've seen in any video game. Now, if you stop and look closely at the gameplay models using photo mode, however, there's definitely a sense that Part 1 has an edge in terms of overall detail. Joel appears weirdly older and more grizzled in the remake, but there's no doubt that his in-game model more closely resembles the real-time cutscenes now. That said, it's important to keep in mind with this comparison that The Last of Us Part 2 maxes out at 1440p, while The Last of Us Part 1 is being shown here at native 4K. Weapon and clothing are very similar, but they've definitely made changes to the weapon model and its texturing, as opposed to just lifting the Last of Us Part 2 assets directly into the new game. So, given all this, perhaps we should shift gears a little bit and talk about the gameplay. You see, Naughty Dog promised enhanced gameplay, but what does that actually mean in practice? In renovating a game like The Last of Us, there's at least two potential avenues of design one could follow. The first involves implementing new play mechanics entirely. In this case, that would essentially mean building upon the work done for The Last of Us Part 2. In that game, characters are more agile with the option to go prone, allowing players to more efficiently stalk their prey through tall grass while executing stealth kills with increased precision and speed. Or, instead, you stick with the previous design, focusing more on recreating and enhancing that original experience rather than completely altering the core mechanics. In this case, Naughty Dog has opted for the latter. That is, The Last of Us Part 1's Joel is limited to the same basic moveset featured in the original game, rather than adopting the faster gameplay of Part 2. So what did they actually change? Well, it's actually more than I expected. Animation, camera work, enemy behavior, and more has all been changed. But what does that look like? Basically, the core shooting mechanics are now more in line with The Last of Us Part 2. Camera position, the weapon animations, the hit reactions, and the like are all more polished, I would say. Let's compare starting with the aiming. Watch closely, and you'll notice that each version actually has its own animation for transitioning between movement mode and aiming mode, but the PS5 version shares more with The Last of Us Part 2. The use of motion blur, the smoother but slightly slower zoom effect, and aiming position are all comparable now. The character is obscured by a subtle depth of field, just like Part 2, whereas the original game uses depth of field only in the distance instead. As we pull the trigger, watch the animation. Again, all three versions feature different movement and response, but Part 1 shares more with Part 2 than it does with The Last of Us Remastered. And the same is true when using the shotgun. Different reticle, unique animation, and a stronger kickback all lend the game a different feel from the original. And once you start actually using these weapons in combat, it becomes more evident. The basic moving and shooting action has been overhauled indeed, and Part 1 ends up feeling like a nice hybrid between the two games. Of course, Joel doesn't have the mobility of Ellie or Abby from Part 2, and this is something I've been thinking about. The level design has been altered at points, but usually in a more delicate manner. Things like windows or doors are moved or removed, and object placement in general has been shifted. However, the basic layouts are roughly the same, and I'd imagine this is the reason the team opted to avoid introducing the more sophisticated stealth system in the sequel. That game has level design specifically tailored around the moveset. Large patches of grass like this allow you to sneak around your targets. The challenge is built with this in mind. The original game, however, does not take this into account and would have required significant alterations, which is a tricky line to walk. I mean, I would have enjoyed completely new levels, but who knows how the vocal fanbase would react to this. They basically run the risk of producing a Metal Gear Solid The Twin Snakes scenario where adapting more advanced play mechanics into levels not designed for them kinda breaks the game. Whether you appreciate this decision or not, I suspect this is the reason it was designed this way. But that does not mean that changes to the combat haven't been implemented. There are significant alterations to the AI. Remember, although The Last of Us was popular at release, it was also kind of a memeable game, if you will. The poster child of an AI companion running around doing stupid things while you're hiding for your life. This scene kind of demonstrates what I mean. So this is the point when Tommy's dam comes under attack. Your companions rush into cover as the enemy begins their assault. Pay close attention to Tommy's behavior though. 20 seconds after Joel first takes cover, Tommy walks in from the left with his rifle drawn. The enemy AI at a distance then rushes out of cover and engages in a fist fight with Tommy, who then knocks him back. Moments later, he gets a punch in himself, then takes another step backward. He then draws his pistol while Tommy's at a distance, but then Tommy rushes in head first and they trade blows again, but this time the enemy backs up, holds his weapon to Tommy's head before busting into a full-on sprint and dashing off to the left, completely out of sight. Despite the rest of the commotion in the scene though, Tommy begins all nonchalantly walking away, almost as if the situation is over. But then, 4 seconds later, our durable foe bursts back into the scene, rushing Tommy, but before he can attack, Tommy pulls a 1-2 punch, knocking him off screen. He then pulls out his rifle, fires a single shot, and presumably kills him at last. Tommy then calmly walks away before eventually returning to cover. This altercation lasted nearly 30 seconds. At this point, I'm waiting for the time to hit. That is, when doing nothing, how long does it take for the AI to actually reach and attack Joel? In this case, after nearly 2 minutes of waiting, that answer never arrived. No enemy managed to hit Joel. On PlayStation 5, however, check out the difference. So the enemy burst through the door again, killing a friendly on the way out, before taking out another fellow that had just taken cover off to the right of Joel. At this point then, the enemy manages to hit Joel's leg, drawing blood. The time to hit is 13 seconds. I'm forced to take him out or face death, but after doing so, you can watch the rest of the scene unfurl. The AI manages to clear out the room entirely, allowing you to move on. If you look at the walkway above though, you'll see a couple guys popping up once in a while, firing off rounds into something. I think these guys are just for show, that or they're playing Time Crisis 2. Either way, it's safe to run out of this room now. So let's try another scene. At this point, Joel is knocked off his horse and forced to engage. This time it's just him and Tommy. Shortly after taking cover here on PS4 Pro, an enemy begins his approach from the middle, walking towards the left. He continues off screen, fighting with Tommy for a moment. I'm sure they're up to no good over there, but if you wait a little bit longer, you'll see him re-emerge from the left side of the screen and make his way back to the fallen tree. He then immediately turns around and starts firing his weapon. At the 22-second mark, Joel takes his first hit from a nearby explosion, so that's technically our time to hit for PS4. Of course, if we watch the scene continue, the enemy will fall back behind the tree trunk, then come out running again, only to be killed by Tommy. On PS5, however, that same guy comes running out of cover and manages to hit Joel with a single shot. The time to hit here is 13 seconds. Okay, so remember that original 2012 E3 demo for The Last of Us? If you recall, this demo made waves when it was shown during Sony's E3 press conference that year, but when the final game shipped, the behavior of the AI didn't quite match expectations. Of course, this is a carefully crafted trailer, keep in mind, but I kinda wanted to see if I could replicate this sequence myself. So in testing, I started each run by taking out this enemy quietly, just like we see in the trailer, then firing a single shot before dashing towards the couch and taking cover. Based on several runs, I determined that the AI basically tends to behave in one of two ways. They either hold back doing nothing, or they rush in as fast as possible, like this guy here. I appreciate Ellie's brick throwing skills though. At this point, I'm left with no choice but to take this guy out, and then I turn my attention back to the room. As the powder from the fire extinguisher begins to settle, I scan the room for enemy movement, and see basically none at this point. We've long since fallen out of sync with the E3 demo, of course, so I turn my attention to the apartment off to the right, and that's where I encounter my next foe. This is one example of the enemy attempting to circle behind the player to get the drop on them. But in general, the stalking behavior we see in the E3 trailer never quite plays out that way. Now with part 1, I started each run the same way as before. Sneak in through the window, grab the guy, fire a shot down the hallway, and then run towards the couch. My first attempts at duplicating the demo kind of failed though. I started on the default difficulty, and attempting to duplicate the same actions in the demo resulted in a quick death each time, which was not actually the case with The Last of Us Remastered on PS4, so that's kinda different. I then reduced the difficulty and had better luck this time. In general, even on the easier modes though, enemies seem to occupy more of a gray area in terms of reaction. They can still be aggressive of course, quite aggressive in fact, but they also tend to use cover more strategically and move around the battlefield more discreetly, rather than just running around like a headless chicken. I couldn't perfectly duplicate the demo of course, but I felt like the AI behavior is more nuanced than before. This also highlights one of the gameplay enhancements I noticed. Downing enemies and taking them hostage was always possible in the original game, but I found this slightly awkward when it came to actual execution. With the remake, you can now reliably shoot them in the legs, causing them to stumble, kind of like Resident Evil 4, but you now have the option to run up to them and utilize them as a fresh human shield. Trying to duplicate these same leg shots in the original game does cause them to stagger, but never seem to trigger the prompt to actually grab them. At least not reliably, like in this instance, I shoot him once, try to grab him, doesn't work, shoot him again, and this time the prompt for grabbing appears. Whether or not this is realistic is up for debate of course, but this does add a layer of fresh strategy to the core gameplay, and it's something I felt throughout the game. Also worth mentioning, the world itself feels more reactive this time. There's an increase in the number of physics-based objects strewn across the environment, plus improvements to the game's destruction system. Like in this instance, chunks of marble break apart as you fire away at this pillar. But if we look back at the original game, you just get these basic decals instead. There's simply more granularity within the remake's interactions, and it makes a pretty big difference in the end. So basically, when you combine the new AI behavior with the improved shooting mechanics and more reactive environments, I'd say the game feels suitably different. It represents much of what Naughty Dog refers to as improved gameplay, and the description seems rather accurate. Next up, we have the audio. And fundamentally, the voice acting, music, and sound effects all seem to have been pulled directly from the already fantastic sounding original game, but the transition to PlayStation 5 does offer some benefits, largely centered around positional audio. So I sampled several scenes initially using my 7.1 home theater setup, and did note some improvements to the overall soundstage. Presence is enhanced, but honestly, overall, it remains largely comparable, I thought. Headphones, on the other hand, offer a different experience entirely thanks to the system's 3D audio support. On PlayStation 4, using a normal pair of headphones, the game sounds wonderful, but with the typical stereo imaging. Yet on PlayStation 5, the positional qualities are greatly accentuated. I've recorded a sample from the game during a rainy sequence to demonstrate what I'm talking about. To hear this test properly though, you might want to plug in a pair of headphones. One other caveat, I'm using the middle 3D audio profile, so your experience may vary slightly. So let's take a listen.
Holy moly. I guess this is what these buildings look like up close. Holy moly. I guess this is what these buildings look like up close.
A lot of the surrounding areas to the quarantine zones, hoping to kill as much of the infected as possible.
What the hell was that?
Tess, you hear that?
Oh, wait, yeah.
Are we safe? Are we safe?
For now. Come on.
Over here.
What did you think? Did you notice a difference? Okay though, I feel like we've covered a lot of ground at this point. This video is getting to be pretty long, so let's start wrapping it up. Playing and writing about The Last of Us Part 1 has been an interesting exercise. I can attest that if you've not played the original in a while, it actually feels rather similar when you first pick up that controller. But the deeper you dig, the more obvious it becomes that they really did put a ton of work into this game. It's as complete a remake as you could hope for given the age of the original. It also kind of revived my own interest in doing these comparison videos. Most modern games basically look the same on every platform, with the only real difference being things like pixel count or frame rate, but examining remakes like this is a whole different ballgame. Now, I'm not here to throw down a review score at the end or recommend that you check it out. That's up to you, but I think what we've discussed today at least showcases what has changed, at least some of it. Ultimately, while I still feel that The Last of Us Part 2 maybe plays better overall, due in part to the level design and the new moveset, this new PS5 release is the best version of the original The Last of Us. But that's all from me for the moment. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and if you did, be sure to like, subscribe, ring the notification bell, follow us on Twitter, all that good stuff, and we'll see you next time.